Hello and welcome. Whether you're listening late at night with tired eyes or resting during a quiet moment of your day, this soft journey invites you to drift into the distant past. Make yourself comfortable. Let the day's tension melt away as you settle in. Together, we'll step back hundreds of years into the world of medieval Europe, not through the noise of clashing swords or the chaos of battle, but through a peaceful, reflective exploration of what life was truly like for the armies who marched across the continent. This is You Wouldn't Last a Day on a Medieval European Battlefield, a gentle voyage through the realities of warfare that often went unseen. Take a slow, deep breath. As you exhale, imagine a cool morning mist rolling over an empty field at dawn. Picture the soft glow of the rising sun stretching across dew-covered grass long before the day's battles began. Here, in this quiet retelling, we drift far from violence and fear. Instead, we explore the world. Behind the scenes, the endless marches, the heavy armor that tested a soldier's strength, the lack of comfort or sanitation, and the quiet resilience required to endure life on campaign. We walk through history not with urgency, but with calm curiosity. Imagine yourself standing on the outskirts of a medieval camp. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. Canvas tents rise like pale shapes in the early light, their edges fluttering gently in a cool breeze. Somewhere nearby, horses shift and snort softly, their breaths warm in the chilled air. You might be lying in bed or sitting comfortably now, but part of you can almost hear the distant clatter of armor being adjusted, or the hushed voices of soldiers sharing a simple morning meal. Let your worries fade, letting them fall away like echoes disappearing across an open plain. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore the hidden challenges of medieval warfare, how armies struggled with famine during long marches, how disease spread rapidly through crowded camps, and how the burden of armor shaped every movement a soldier made. We'll listen to the quiet moments of rest around a dim fire, feel the weight of supplies strapped to weary travelers, and observe the slow routines that filled the hours between battles. Through it all, we move at an unhurried pace, allowing each scene to unfold gently, like turning the worn pages of an old chronicle. Now that you are relaxed and ready, let's begin this soft journey into the past. Our first chapter starts with the land itself, the rolling fields, forest paths, and makeshift encampments that defined the medieval soldier's world. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let the calm sounds and quiet imagery of history carry you along. And if you enjoy this peaceful exploration into the medieval world, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can drift into many more stories just like this. Romanticized knights versus harsh reality. Modern media often glorifies medieval battles with valiant knights in shining armor and chivalrous combat. It's easy to imagine oneself standing heroically on a medieval European battlefield, sword in hand, basking in glory. Yet the brutal reality of medieval warfare was anything but glamorous. The truth is that you wouldn't last a single day in those conditions. Life on campaign was a waking nightmare of filth, disease, hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Soldiers endured hardships that would break most of us today. In this calm and measured exploration, we'll peel back the romantic veneer and reveal why a day in a medieval army's ranks would be utterly overwhelming for a modern person. We proceed gently, as if telling a bedtime story, but the facts remain grim. The aim is not to shock, but to highlight the brutal realities of medieval warfare. From lack of sanitation and rampant disease, to gnawing hunger and the crushing weight of armor, all delivered in a soothing tone. Imagine the scene. The sun is just rising over a camp of weary soldiers. A damp mist clings to the ground, trampled by thousands of men and horses. Instead of a triumphant fanfare, the air carries the smell of unwashed bodies and open latrines. If you find comfort in modern amenities like clean water, regular meals, and a warm bed, you'd find none of that here. A medieval battlefield was as hostile as any environment on Earth, and it assaulted all the senses. From dawn till dusk, a soldier's day was filled with physical and mental ordeals that we can scarcely tolerate for an hour, let alone survive for 24 hours. In this script, we will walk through a day in the life of a medieval soldier as calmly and informatively as possible. We'll maintain a gentle, almost lulling narration, even as we describe distressing conditions, an approach akin to a bedtime story about history's harsher side. The content is factual and unembellished, meant for a high school senior or early college, reading level grade, 12 level. Short paragraphs and clear headings will help guide us through each aspect of the experience. As we journey from the waking hours in camp to the chaos of battle and its aftermath, you will understand why most of us would not last even a single day under such conditions. Now, take a deep breath and steel yourself. It's time to wake up in a medieval army camp, where our long, grueling day begins. Dawn in the medieval army camp. It is dawn, but there's no gentle alarm clock, only the blaring sound of a trumpet or the shouted orders of a sergeant rousing the camp. You awaken on the cold ground, perhaps on a thin straw mat inside a canvas tent that barely keeps out the damp. Your body is sore from yesterday's march. Soldiers often trudge 10-20 miles a day on campaign, and you feel every ache. The air is chilly and carries a foul odor that never really goes away. A mix of smoke, sweat, mud, and human waste. There's mud caked on your boots and clothes from previous days. Nothing ever really dries out or gets washed properly here. As you push yourself up, you notice the stench of the camp latrines nearby, if latrines exist at all. In many camps, soldiers simply relieved themselves in ditches or behind bushes not far from where they slept. With thousands of men in close quarters, the accumulation of waste is staggering. A medieval army of 10,000 men could produce around 4 tons of feces per day. Without a proper sanitation system to dispose of it, this waste often lays scattered or in shallow pits. Flies buzz around incessantly, having bred in the filth. They land on the food you're about to eat and on your face, a constant maddening irritation. You likely have itchy bites on your skin this morning. Fleas and lice are your constant companions, nesting in your clothing and hair. In the communal sleeping areas, parasites spread easily from one man to another. Bathing is a rare luxury on campaign. Days or weeks go by without a chance to properly wash your body or clothes. The result is that body lice infestation was almost universal among soldiers. These lice aren't just a minor annoyance. They can carry diseases like typhus, often called camp fever, which would later wreak havoc in armies after around 1450. Even before then, the itching and discomfort from lice, and the boils or sores from their bites, add another layer of misery to your day. But in the calm of early morning, you scratch at your dirty hair and try not to think about it too much. This is simply the norm for everyone here. Stepping out of your tent, or if you slept under the open sky, rising from your blanket, you see the camp stirring. Small cook fires are being lit using damp wood and whatever kindling is at hand. The smoke from last night's fires still hangs in the air. All around, Men cough and spit. Respiratory issues are common after sleeping in the damp cold, and many have a chronic cough. You join your comrades to see about a meager breakfast. If you're lucky, you have a bit of stale bread left, or some hard-tack biscuit. Perhaps there's a pot of thin gruel heating over a fire, a mix of water and ground grain, maybe with a few root vegetables, or scraps of salt pork if available. There's no fresh coffee or tea to warm you up. Those stimulants aren't part of your world. Instead, you might have a sip of weak ale or wine, safer than water, to start the Yobel day. Water can be dangerous here. The nearby stream also carries the waste of the camp, and drinking unboiled water from it can easily give you diarrhea. As you eat your bland ration, you look around at the other men. Their faces are gaunt and unwashed, many sporting patchy beards full of dirt. Some scratch at lice, just as you did. A few are already moaning in pain from stomach cramps. You know, at least a couple of your comrades are sick with what we now call dysentery, the infamous flux of the bowels that soldiers dread. Indeed, one of the most common and deadly ailments in a medieval army camp was dysentery. You try not to think about it, but you can't entirely block out the sound of someone groaning and rushing off behind a tent to empty his bowels for the 5th time since midnight. This is how your day begins. Hungry, cold, itchy, and enveloped in foul smells. And the real trials haven't even started yet. Despite all of this, the atmosphere is not one of panic, but of weary routine. The veteran soldiers among you take it in stride. They crack dark jokes about the smell or the lice. Gallows humor is a soldier's remedy for despair. You might hear a joke like, "Well, at least the flies prefer him today, not me," followed by a dry chuckle. It's a calm resignation. Everyone knows this is just how life is on campaign. As a newcomer, imagine you are a modern person, magically placed here. You would likely be gagging from the odors and in a state of shock at the lack of basic comfort. But for them, it's another morning. Before the march or battle that awaits, you must take care of your personal needs as best you can in this environment. Do you need to relieve yourself? If so, you'll have to join the others at the makeshift latrines, perhaps a shallow trench dug at the edge of camp. There's little privacy. You might squat among comrades, exposed to the chilly air, doing your business quickly to avoid the smell and the embarrassment. If the army has been in this location for a few days, the designated latrine area is likely a disgusting pit, brimming with excrement and swarming with flies. There might be no toilet paper. At best, you have a rag or some leaves or moss to clean yourself. Sanitation is primitive, and you're painfully aware that these unsanitary conditions are a breeding ground for disease. As you rise from the latrine trench and make your way back, you carefully step over rivulets of dirty water and refuse. The ground in camp is often muddy with waste and spilled food. If it has rained recently, the whole area is a quagmire of mud mixed with garbage and human filth. Clean drinking water has to be fetched from somewhere, hopefully upstream, but sometimes in desperation, men will fill their flasks from puddles or any water they find. You recall a story shared among the men. In a recent campaign, some soldiers were so thirsty they drank from a stagnant pond in a battlefield, only to later discover a rotting animal carcass in it. The soldier recounting it said with grim irony, "We drank it cold and without boiling. We were that thirsty," and everyone listening had nodded in understanding. Desperation often leaves no room for fastidiousness. By the time the sun is fully up, the camp is dismantling and preparing to move, or preparing for battle. depending on the day's plan. You wolf down whatever breakfast you had. There is no luxury of lingering over a meal. Officers are already shouting for men to get into marching order or to assemble by units. You hastily roll up your bedding, if any, and pack your gear. The day's true labor is about to begin, and you already feel a pit in your stomach that's not just hunger. It's also anxiety, because you know how hard this day might be. Whether it will be another endless march or a bloody battle by afternoon, neither prospect is comforting, yet you steel yourself and carry on, because a medieval soldier has no choice but to endure. With this morning vignette in mind, let's explore in greater detail the key hardships that make this life so unbearable for anyone accustomed to modern comforts. We will examine the lack of sanitation, the rampant infectious diseases, the ever-present hunger and malnutrition, and the physical strain of heavy armor and weaponry. We'll also touch on the sheer brutality of combat and the mental toll it takes. Each of these factors by itself could debilitate you. Together, they made medieval warfare a living hell. Yet we'll discuss them calmly and clearly, point by point, painting a full picture of why surviving even a single day was an incredible feat of endurance. No, escape from filth, lack of sanitation, in camp. Perhaps the most immediate and relentless hardship in a medieval military camp was the lack of sanitation. Modern standards of cleanliness did not exist. Forget flushing toilets, showers, or hand sanitizer. Those were centuries away. On a medieval battlefield, or in a campaign camp, filth was a constant companion. Human waste, garbage, and mud created a breeding ground for disease and discomfort. Latrines and human waste. Most medieval armies made only rudimentary attempts at sanitation. If the army camped for more than a day or two, they might dig simple latrine trenches at the edge of the camp. These trenches were just shallow ditches where men would relieve themselves. Ideally, they were supposed to be away from the water supply and living areas. However, in the chaos of campaign, this wasn't always enforced or possible. Sometimes the latrines were too close to camp or too close to streams, contaminating the water. Often, soldiers didn't even bother with the trenches at night or during battle. They would squat wherever they could. The cumulative result was appalling. The ground became littered with feces and urine. As mentioned, an army of 10,000 could produce 4 tons of excrement daily. If not properly buried or removed, and usually it wasn't, that amount of waste quickly turned any encampment into a foul swamp of disease. Moreover, latrines could be dangerous to use in certain situations. In active battle conditions or in view of the enemy, stepping away to use the latrine could get you killed. Historical anecdotes from later periods like World War I describe soldiers so fearful of enemy fire that they would relieve themselves in a can inside their trench rather than expose themselves to a sniper. In medieval times, during a siege or a close standoff, similar fears could arise. Popping out of cover to answer nature's call might make one an easy target for an enemy arrow. Therefore, soldiers sometimes had to hold it in under dire circumstances or improvise very unsafe, unsanitary solutions like a bucket in a trench or just going in their armor. One can only imagine the humiliation and discomfort of such situations. Even when not under immediate enemy threat, using the latrine in camp was an unpleasant ordeal. One veteran's account, from a much later era, admittedly, described how the stink of excrement competed with the smell of death in their positions. In a medieval camp, The smell alone could be overwhelming. Without modern knowledge of germs, soldiers didn't fully understand that these terrible smells were harbingers of microscopic killers. They just knew that a filthy camp made life miserable. Soldiers cursed the lack of proper latrines and often joked crudely about it. But they had no real solution. Bathing and cleaning were luxuries. Living in dirt was the norm. Personal hygiene. After dealing with the communal filth, consider personal hygiene, or the lack thereof. On campaign, soldiers rarely had the opportunity to bathe. They might wash their face and hands occasionally in a stream, if the water wasn't needed solely for drinking, but full baths were infrequent. Soap existed in medieval times, often a lye-based soap, but carrying enough for an army or prioritizing soap for soldiers was not common. Thus, layers of sweat, dirt, and grime accumulated on the skin. Combine that with the fact that soldiers often wore the same clothes day after day, sometimes sleeping in them, and you have a recipe for skin infections and discomfort. Rashes, chafing, and sores were common from constant contact with dirty clothing and armor. If you got a small cut or blister, it would likely get filthy and could easily become infected in this environment. Clothes were infested with parasites. Lice thrived in the seams of tunics and undergarments. Fleas from camp dogs or rats would hop onto humans and bite. The presence of lice was so ubiquitous that people accepted it as a part of life. Medieval writings occasionally mention methods to delouse oneself, like using a fine comb, but on a campaign, spending time to comb out lice eggs, nits, was a losing battle. Lice carry typhus, a deadly disease that causes high fevers and delirium, known to decimate soldiers. While typhus became recognized in the late Middle Ages, the term typhus wasn't used yet, but outbreaks occurred. Even without understanding the cause, soldiers experienced its wrath. In the late 15th century, for instance, the Spanish army fighting in Granada, 1489, suffered an epidemic of typhus, carried by lice, which killed more soldiers than combat did. Earlier in the 14th century, flea-borne plague, the Black Death, also occasionally struck armies. Fleas infesting rats in camps could pass on bubonic plague, as happened during sieges in the mid-1300s. Notably, the Black Death did not spare military camps. If an army was campaigning during plague years, it might suddenly find thousands of its men falling ill and dying horrifically. One reason medieval commanders hesitated to campaign during plague outbreaks was precisely this vulnerability. Water and food contamination. Lack of sanitation directly impacted water and food quality. Armies tried to locate their camps near fresh water sources, rivers, streams, wells. But if the army polluted that water with its own waste, it became a source of illness. Imagine an encampment by a gentle stream. Upstream the knights water their horses, midstream the men fill cooking pots, and just downstream others wash their soiled clothes or relieve themselves. It wouldn't take long for the downstream part to become foul. Many soldiers, unaware of microscopic pathogens, believed cloudy or smelly water was bad air, or corrupted in some undefined way. They might prefer beer or wine when possible because those were safer. The fermentation or boiling in brewing killed many germs. But often, water was the only tama, available drink, and thirsty soldiers would drink any water they could get. Chronic diarrhea was the price many paid. In a prolonged camp, efforts were sometimes made to dig a proper latrine pit and then cover it with dirt each day, an early form of sanitation. Some enlightened commanders in history did try to maintain cleaner camps. For example, the Romans, far earlier, were famous for better camp sanitation than most armies. They dug deep latrines and enforced their use. But medieval armies were generally less organized about this. They also had camp followers, women, children, sutlers, who added to the population, generating waste. There are references in medieval chronicles to disease striking camps. At the siege of Rouen in 1418, 1900 Years' War, the English besiegers suffered diseases, likely aggravated by camp filth, and the French civilians inside the city were dying of starvation and disease as well. Siege camps were particularly nasty. Armies stayed put, turning fields outside a fortress into cesspools over weeks or months of encirclement. One notorious disease tied to poor sanitation was nicknamed the siege disease, dysentery. During any long siege or encampment, dysentery almost inevitably broke out. Medieval people called it the bloody flux because of the bloody diarrhea it caused. Without proper latrines and with contaminated food and water, dysentery could rip through an army. We'll discuss disease more in the next section, but it's important to note here that poor sanitation was enemy number one for armies, responsible for more deaths over time than any sword or arrow. To put it bluntly, a medieval battlefield environment was literally sickening. If you are used to flushing toilets and regular showers, the conditions in a medieval camp would revolt you. The smell alone might make you vomit on day one. Many new soldiers likely did gag until they got desensitized. Not to mention, if you accidentally got someone else's waste on you, not unlikely if you slip in the muck or have to handle waste in camp duty, you'd have no immediate way to properly sanitize yourself. It's a calm morning here, but filth is everywhere, clinging to your boots and clothes and skin. The connection between filth and illness was observed, even if germ theory wasn't known. Commanders who saw their troops falling ill sometimes intuitively realized the camp needed cleaning. There are instances in medieval records of camps being moved to new ground simply because the old site had become too befouled and corrupt to health. They didn't know bacteria, but they knew foul dirt, and odors seemed to breed sickness. The stinking smell was more than just an offense to the nose. It signaled the presence of rot and decay that could kill. In summary, the lack of sanitation meant that a medieval soldier spent his days and nights in conditions that would be considered a public health emergency today. Fecal matter, garbage, and vermin were constant. The average person today might not last a day, partly because our bodies and noses aren't accustomed to such an onslaught of pathogens and filth. You'd be at high risk of gastrointestinal illness almost immediately, and even if you avoided that, the omnipresent dirt and stink would severely test your resolve. And yet, in a medieval army, this was just the backdrop, the stage upon which even worse trials, like disease and combat, would play out. Before moving on, picture one more calm but unpleasant detail. It's midday now, perhaps, and the army is on the march, or waiting for battle. You feel the urge to relieve yourself again. Everyone does. Regularly. Maybe last night's meager stew didn't agree with you. There are no bushes on the open road and no privacy. Eventually, you can't hold it. You step aside, drop your breeches in full view of comrades, and do what you must. It's embarrassing, but no one laughs. They've all done the same. You use a scrap of cloth from your pack to wipe, if you have one, and toss it. You pull up your pants and hurry back to formation. This scenario alone Having to defecate in a field with no privacy and minimal cleaning might deter many modern folks from even leaving home. But here, it's routine, and unfortunately, you might not feel much better afterward because you suspect you've caught the camp diarrhea. With a groan, you carry on. There's no escape from the filth, and it's already working its way inside you. Invisible killers, infectious diseases in the ranks. If the lack of sanitation was the cause, then infectious diseases were the deadly effect. Medieval warfare's greatest killer wasn't the sword or arrow, it was disease. In almost every campaign, more soldiers were incapacitated by illness than by enemy action. The unsanitary conditions we described set the stage for microbes to run rampant. Soldiers lived in close quarters, traded lice and germs, drank fouled water, and ate whatever food they could find, sometimes spoiled. In that environment, epidemics flourished. Let's walk through the common diseases and health hazards that would strike a medieval army and likely strike you down within a day or two if you were suddenly dropped into this setting without immunity. Dysentery, bloody flux. This was the king of camp diseases. Dysentery is essentially a severe intestinal infection, often caused by bacteria like Shigella or amoebic parasites, leading to constant diarrhea, fever, and dehydration. In camps, it spread through contaminated food and water, exactly the situation we have. A soldier with dysentery might pass bloody, mucus-filled stools many times a day, hence, bloody flux. Cramps and weakness accompany it. Once it starts spreading, hundreds of men can get it. Medieval chronicles frequently mention dysentery decimating forces. For example, during King Henry V's campaign in France in 1415, his army besieged the town of Harfleur. The siege dragged on, sanitation was poor, and an epidemic of dysentery erupted. By the time Henry moved on, as much as 1/5 of his army had died or been incapacitated by dysentery. Many soldiers were so weakened they literally couldn't stand, let alone fight. Some fought anyway. At the subsequent Battle of Agincourt, English longbowmen, who were still suffering dysentery, reportedly fought with their pants off or cut open, so they could relieve themselves freely even as they shot arrows. It sounds almost comical, archers with no pants, but it underscores the desperation. The archers simply dropped their pants and did what needed to be done while standing in the firing line. Imagine being that ill, high fever, gut-wrenching pain, uncontrollable diarrhea, and still having to shoot a bow at oncoming armored knights. Dysentery didn't just knock soldiers out of action, it killed many of them. Henry V himself later died of illness, likely dysentery, in 1422 during a siege, showing that even kings weren't immune. If you or I drank from the camp's contaminated water, there's a high chance we'd contract dysentery within days. Without modern medicine, our odds of survival would be poor. Dysentery could kill within days from dehydration. At minimum, you'd be rendered completely incapable of battle, feverish and weak, collapsed in the filth of the latrines. Cholera and typhoid. These are waterborne diseases like dysentery. Cholera, caused by bacteria in water, causes profuse watery diarrhea and vomiting leading to dehydration. It was not well documented in European armies in the Middle Ages. Cholera pandemics struck later, in the 19th century, but other forms of what they called flux might have included cholera-like illness, typhoid fever, caused by Salmonella typhi bacteria from contaminated water, food, certainly existed. Typhoid causes high fever, abdominal pain, and sometimes delirium and rash. It could sweep through camps, especially in warmer weather. Historical accounts are not always specific on typhoid, often calling any fever camp fever, but modern historians suspect typhoid was a common killer. For instance, during the 430 BCE plague of Athens, long before medieval times, typhoid is suspected to have been the cause that killed a third of the city. In medieval contexts, similar outbreaks likely happened. A 6-week siege might end not because the attackers gave up, but because they fell deathly ill. Typhus, camp fever. As mentioned, epidemic typhus is spread by brocked body lice. It causes sustained high fevers, headache, rash, and often stupor. The word typhus comes from Greek for hazy because it causes clouded consciousness. Typhus was first noted around 1489 during the Spanish campaign against the Moors, when it killed a large portion of the Spanish army, so it emerged in late medieval times. After that, it became a frequent scourge of armies in the 16th and 17th centuries. If you were in a medieval camp slightly later, say 1500, typhus might strike. People didn't know lice were the carriers. They just knew that lousy, dirty camps bred a deadly fever. The close quarters, men sleeping head to head on the ground, sharing blankets, ensured that if one man's clothing was full of infected lice, soon everyone's was. Typhus could incapacitate an army faster than any enemy attack. Victims would get delirious. Some might try to wander off in confusion or simply lie down and never wake up. In a day, you could go from healthy to burning with 40 degrees Celsius fever. Without antibiotics, centuries in the future, typhus often killed. A modern person with no prior exposure would be extremely vulnerable in a louse-ridden camp. Respiratory diseases. Living outdoors in damp, cold conditions with lots of smoke inhalation from campfires means coughs and chest infections were common. Pneumonia could fell soldiers who were weakened from fatigue and exposure. Crowding meant tuberculosis could spread slowly as well. TB was widespread, historically. A prolonged campaign in winter could see men dying from what they'd call lung fever. If you spend a rainy night shivering and then march wet the next day, you might catch a severe cold that turns into pneumonia. With no antibiotics, a simple bacterial pneumonia could be fatal. There's also influenza. Flu epidemics did occur in medieval times. A flu passing through camp might lay everyone low with high fever and aches for a week. In weakened individuals, it could kill. Malaria and other local diseases. Depending on the region, armies had to face local endemic diseases. In some parts of southern Europe and the Near East, malaria was a risk transmitted by mosquitoes in marshy areas. Crusader armies in the Holy Land noted fevers that sound like malaria, especially when camping near swamps or in the heat of summer. Imagine wearing armor under a broiling sun by mosquito-infested marshes. You could contract malaria and be racked with cyclical fevers and chills. Another disease was ergotism, from eating fungus-infected grain, which caused terrible convulsions and gangrene. While not contagious, it could affect an army if their grain supply was bad. Soldiers sometimes suffered food poisoning or intestinal worms from consuming poorly cooked or tainted meat. In fact, archaeological evidence indicates that intestinal parasites, like roundworm and whipworm, infected a large portion of medieval populations due to fertilizing crops with human waste and poor hygiene. As a soldier, eating off the land or unwashed produce could mean you ingest worm eggs. Over time, those worms cause malnutrition and illness, sapping your strength. Wound infections, blood poisoning. Even if you weren't sick at the start of the day, a single wound in battle could expose you to infection. Battlefield wounds often turned septic. There was no knowledge of sterilization. Swords, arrows, and spears plunged into bodies, dragging dirt and bacteria in with them. If you survived a battle with a deep wound, the days following were perilous. The wound could fester with pus. You'd develop a fever. They might call it putrid fever. Common bacteria could cause tetanus, lockjaw, or gangrene in wounds. Medieval surgeons sometimes tried crude treatments, pouring boiling oil or wine into wounds, or packing with moss or herbs. But many wounds simply became fatal after the fact. Something as simple as a small cut from mishandling your own knife in camp could turn into a life-threatening infection if not kept clean. And how could it be kept clean in that environment? Soldiers knew that even a minor injury could putrefy. The cumulative effect of all these diseases meant that an army camp was a ticking time bomb of illness. Historical records repeatedly show armies losing huge numbers, not in combat, but in camp. One chilling statistic: in many eras, disease deaths could outnumber combat deaths by 2 to 1 or more. For example, during the American Civil War, much later, 2/3 of deaths were from disease, not battle, and that was with 19th century knowledge. In medieval times, the proportion may have been even higher in prolonged campaigns. For someone from the modern world, our immune systems might not be prepared for the onslaught of pathogens in a medieval camp. We benefit from widespread vaccinations and relatively sanitary living conditions. Dropped into a medieval battlefield, you might catch multiple ailments simultaneously, perhaps a case of dysentery weakening you, which then makes you susceptible to pneumonia. It was not uncommon for soldiers to suffer the flux and then die of a secondary infection. A medieval saying was that disease reaps more than the sword. You would notice by midday that dozens of men in your unit are coughing, feverish, or complaining of dysentery symptoms. By nightfall, some of them might be dead, or at least unable to stand. And you, if lucky to avoid the initial wave, might still have a ticking time bomb incubating inside. Most infections take a day or more to manifest symptoms. The concept of an asymptomatic carrier wasn't known, but they existed. One guy might look fine while spreading illness to others, via shared drink, or simply by his fleas hopping around. Consider a concrete scenario. Agincourt, 1415 mentioned earlier. The English army was already sick from dysentery before the battle. Chronicles mention men so ill they had to lean on their weapons. One colourful, though possibly apocryphal detail, is that English archers, when the battle was about to start, coated their arrowheads in their own feces, essentially making a crude biological weapon. They had plenty of feces around because of the dysentery. An arrow that caused even a slight wound would then introduce bacteria into the enemy's body, almost guaranteeing a fatal infection if the wound wasn't immediately fatal. This might sound horrific, and it is, but it's an example of how disease and war intertwined. The French knights at Agincourt, even if not killed outright, might die days later from infected arrow wounds. So even the act of fighting became a vector for infection. During sieges, disease was often the deciding factor. The defenders inside a castle or town might be safe from arrows, but they often ran out of food and had to drink foul water. Dysentery or plague could erupt inside the crowded fortress and force a surrender. The attackers, outside might similarly suffer in their trenches. One side or the other would break when disease thinned their ranks. A famous example, during the Seventh Crusade, 1248 to 1250, King Louis IX of France invaded Egypt. At the siege of Al-Mansura, his army got struck by disease, probably a mix of dysentery and scurvy from malnutrition. The king himself nearly died of illness, and the campaign failed with a huge portion of the army sick or dead. Another, the First Crusade, saw innumerable deaths from disease. In Antioch, soldiers starved and got sick. In the camps, they died of what likely were dysentery and maybe typhus. Chronicles mention that people were flinging themselves into rivers to cool the fever, or that the ground was covered with the dead. Those are disease victims, not necessarily battle casualties. The medieval understanding of disease was limited to notions like bad air, miasma, or divine punishment, or imbalance of humors. So, soldiers might carry protective amulets or pray to saints for health, but they didn't know to, say, boil water or isolate the sick effectively. They did observe some practical measures. If a disease outbreak became obvious, sometimes camps were moved to a fresh location, which could help a bit. They also knew that a rotting corpse could sicken people, so they tried to dump bodies away from camp or bury them. Mass graves were common after battles to prevent the stench and potential poisonous vapors. Nonetheless, in the thick of campaign, there was only so much they could do. If your comrade falls ill with a fever, you might still share a blanket with him that night. You won't abandon him unless ordered to, which sometimes happened if things got desperate. One particularly merciless practice. In some recorded cases, when the army had to move and leave behind the very sick, those poor souls were left by the roadside. Medieval chronicler accounts and letters note that on marches, the sick, who could no longer walk, were often left to die or were found and killed by enemy scouts. In a calm tone, imagine marching through a forest and seeing figures lying by the road, moaning for water or mercy. Those are the abandoned sick from your own army, left because the column couldn't stop. You might say a quick prayer for them, but you keep walking. You have to. It's a haunting image, but it was reality. Marches were not suspended for those who fell ill. The sick were left by the side of the road to die, or were eventually dispatched by roving enemies. This quote comes from a historian's study of the Crusades. It underscores how disease literally meant you wouldn't last a day. If you collapsed, you were done. No medevac, no ambulance, no field hospital to properly care for you. Field hospitals were rudimentary at best. More on that in a moment. A modern person used to calling in sick and resting in bed would find no such sympathy here. If you can't keep up due to illness, you're left behind. In such an environment, it's clear why we say you wouldn't last a day. Even if you avoided arrows and swords, the very air, water, and soil of the medieval battlefield would conspire to infect you. By nighttime, on day one, you might already be feverish from an infection you picked up at dawn. Or perhaps you wake up on day two with crippling stomach pain and begin the dash to the latrine again and again. Dysentery has you in its grip. Without modern rehydration therapy, you grow weak. On day three, you can't march. You fall behind, and your comrades sadly leave you propped against a tree on the roadside, a water skin by your side, if they're kind. You shiver with fever under the same sun that beat down on you mercilessly the day before. Maybe an enemy scout finds you and puts a spear in you to end your misery. Or maybe you simply fade away from dehydration. This is not melodrama. It happened countless times. We continue in a calm narrative voice, but the facts themselves are stark. Disease was the grim reaper of medieval warfare, silently mowing down far more than arrows or swords. As we shall see in the next section though, hunger could be just as cruel a foe. Before leaving the topic of disease, one might wonder, did any soldiers have ways to cope or treat illnesses? They had some remedies. Herbal potions, like poppy for pain, various plants for digestive issues, bloodletting, or purging, as per the medical theories of humors, and a lot of praying. A knight might have a personal physician, if he was high-ranking, who might attempt treatments. However, most common soldiers had to rely on camp healers, or nothing at all. If you collapsed, perhaps a friend would spoon some thin broth into you, or a priest would hear your confession, but effective cures were rare. Perhaps the best treatment was simply robust constitution. Those who survived epidemics likely had stronger immune systems or just sheer luck. Over time, a medieval soldier might gain some immunity to local diseases. For instance, someone who had dysentery and survived would have short-term immunity to that strain. But new recruits, or those entering a new region's disease environment, often suffered. You, as an outsider, would have none of that hard-earned resistance. The invisible killers in the medieval battlefield are among the first things that would take you out, quietly and efficiently, often before you ever face the enemy in combat. Marching on empty stomachs, hunger, thirst, and malnutrition. As midday turns to afternoon on our imagined day, another brutal reality sets in: hunger and thirst. A medieval army on campaign was often perilously close to starvation. Logistics were rudimentary. Feeding thousands of men daily was one of the hardest tasks. Modern people are used to a steady supply of calories and hydration. In a medieval army, you might be marching on an empty stomach under a hot sun, with little prospect of a proper meal by day's end. Consider that an active adult male, like a soldier, needs roughly 3,000 calories a day or more when doing heavy physical activity. Now consider how an army might obtain those calories in a pre-industrial world. They carried some supplies, hard bread, dried meat, grain, but only what could be loaded on wagons or pack animals. They relied on foraging and local markets or plunder to get fresh food. If the local land was poor or scorched by the enemy, there was nothing to eat. Preservation options were limited: smoked or salted. Meat can keep. Hard cheese, dried legumes, grains can keep. But green vegetables, fresh meat, etc. were rare on campaign. On a hard march, soldiers often had to make do with minimal rations. One common meal was a sort of gruel or porridge. Grain, like wheat, barley, or oats, boiled in water into a thick soup. If lucky, it might include some beans or a bit of meat. Soldiers also baked flatbread from flour and water, like a simple hardtack or bannock, over campfires. Meat, when available, was usually salted beef or pork that they carried in barrels, extremely salty, requiring soaking or boiling, and making you thirsty. Fresh meat came only if animals were slaughtered, like a horse that broke a leg, or cattle seized from a village. Now, often the daily ration was not sufficient to meet that 3,000 calorie need. Undernourishment was common, especially on long campaigns. A historian notes that armies that are not fed sufficiently will eventually dissolve away as men desert rather than starve. Indeed, History records many instances of soldiers deserting or mutinying due to lack of food. Starvation is a foe that cares nothing for bravery or discipline. If the belly is empty for too long, units fall apart. Thirst was equally a problem. Soldiers carried flasks or skins, but water was heavy and not always at hand. If marching through dry areas or in summer, dehydration was a constant risk. One of the worst fates was to run out of water under a hot sun while encased in armor. A prime example is the Battle of Hattin, 1187, during the Crusades. The Crusader army marched in the Palestinian summer, was lured away from water sources by Saladin's forces, and ended up trapped on a hill, the Horns of Hattin, without water in brutal heat. Men grew faint with thirst. Some reportedly slaughtered their horses just to drink the blood for moisture. They were then routed by Saladin's army. Chroniclers attribute the defeat largely to thirst and exhaustion. It's a clear case where lack of water broke an army. A modern person, used to carrying a water bottle everywhere, would find the sudden onset of severe thirst debilitating. In our scenario, maybe by afternoon your water skin is empty, and the next refill isn't until night. You'd be parched and dizzy, especially after marching in heavy gear, army logistics, and living off the land. Medieval armies did not have modern supply lines or field kitchens, except in rudimentary form. There was no guarantee of 2 meals a day. Often, the expectation was that soldiers would forage, basically find food in the area. This might mean buying food from villages, or, more often, taking it by force. When an army passed through farmland, soldiers would seize grain, livestock, and anything edible. This, of course, was devastating to locals and could lead to famines for them. But even pillaging had limits. If you're in a wasted land, maybe the enemy already burned crops ahead of you. A scorched earth tactic. There's nothing to take. Or if the army stays in one area too long, it quickly eats the place empty. Armies tried to stockpile food, but that required transport. Baggage trains with wagons and pack animals carried flour, salt, meat, etc. These could be slow and vulnerable to attack. If a baggage train was lost, common in ambushes, the army instantly went into crisis. The Fourth Crusade, 1204, is a poignant example of logistic failure. Crusaders gathering in Venice had insufficient funds and supplies. They ended up diverting to conquer Christian cities like Zara and eventually Constantinople, basically to loot food and money, because they ran out of food and money to sustain their campaign. An entire infamous episode of history, the sack of Constantinople, was triggered in large part by the hunger and desperation of soldiers who hadn't been fed or paid. A comment from a historian encapsulates it: the entire Fourth Crusade and the diversion to Constantinople essentially occurred because the Crusader army ran out of food and money. Hunger can change the course of events. On a personal level, a hungry soldier is a weak and demoralized soldier. You wake up hungry, march hungry, fight hungry, and sleep hungry. Malnutrition can set in if this lasts weeks. Muscle wasting, scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, if no fruits, vegetables, and overall fatigue. One medieval account from the First Crusade noted that knights, who were used to better food, were at one point reduced to eating barley bread. Barley was considered horse feed or peasant food, and hard to digest for those not used to it. The chronicler observed that if even high-born crusaders were eating barley, they must have hit hard times indeed. It was a sign of dire scarcity. Indeed, the First Crusade saw times when even barley ran out. During the Siege of Antioch, 1097 to 98, famine was so severe that men reportedly boiled leather strips from their gear to chew on, and there are reports, as we touched on, of cannibalism at Ma'ara out of utter desperation. One chronicle claims some of the poorest crusaders cooked and ate the flesh of fallen enemies at Ma'ara when no other food remained. This shocked even their contemporaries, but underscores how hunger can drive humans to extreme acts. Now, let's not assume every single campaign had soldiers starving every day. There were times of plenty too. If an army managed to capture a rich town, they could feast on its stores, often leading to lack of discipline, drunkenness, etc. If an army was well funded, say a royal army with ample coffers, they might have regular rations. But even the best planned campaigns hit snags. Weather could destroy crops, or a supply ship might sink, tipping an army from well-fed to hungry. Also consider the quality of what food there was. Without modern preservation, meat might go bad. Eating semi-spoiled meat could cause dysentery or food poisoning. Grain could be rotten or contaminated with fungus, ergot, which causes hallucinations and sickness. Water might be brackish. You might wolf down something nasty simply because you must. Soldiers were known to eat things like acorns, roots, or grass in extreme situations. In 1315, when a massive famine struck Europe, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, any armies in the field at that time would have suffered immensely. There are accounts of some soldiers becoming so weak they couldn't lift their weapons. Physical effects of hunger and thirst. Marching all day with inadequate food and water leads to exhaustion. You become lightheaded, your stomach aches or becomes numb. Muscles cramp due to lack of electrolytes if you sweat too much without drinking. On the first day, maybe you manage with adrenaline and willpower. But if you hadn't eaten well the previous day either, you might start to stumble. Medieval armies did have a practice. If possible, they'd let soldiers rest or eat before a battle, but that wasn't always under their control. Before some battles, troops were actually famished and exhausted from marching. At the Battle of Agincourt again, the English were tired from a long march and hungry, but arguably the French had also been kept up all night and missed meals. Both sides weren't at their peak, though the English had greater resolve. Another example, just before the Battle of Hastings, 1066, Harold Godwinson's Saxon army had force-marched from London after fighting another battle at Stamford Bridge weeks before, and they reputedly arrived tired and possibly short on supplies. This may have affected their performance against the Normans, so hunger and fatigue directly influenced outcomes of battles. We should mention camp followers here, often soldiers' wives or local women, who would do cooking when possible. They tried to stretch rations, bake bread, make thin stew. These supporting people helped keep the army fed when ingredients were available. But if nothing was available, even the best camp cook can't perform miracles. You cannot conjure flour from bare earth. As you, the modern person, go through the day, perhaps your only sustenance since morning was a chunk of dried bread and a few mouthfuls of watered wine. By afternoon, your stomach is gnawing. Your tongue feels dry because you've been marching in the sun and you rationed your last sip of water hours ago. When the column halts, you desperately look for any stream or well. Suppose you find a brook. You drink, even if the water is a bit suspect. because thirst compels you. That water might refresh you momentarily, but could sicken you later, as we know. Hunger, on the other hand, becomes a dull ache. You dream of food as you march, fantasizing about a hearty meal. But when the army finally encamps at dusk, what do you get? Maybe a bowl of pottage, a thin soup of boiled grain with a few beans. It takes the edge off, but doesn't truly satisfy. You lie down still hungry. Nighttime cold makes it worse. An empty belly can keep you awake, gurgling and paining. A calm narration of hunger might be like describing an endless fast. Hour by hour, the lack of nourishment saps your strength, but you must continue. Medieval commanders feared hunger more than battle in many cases. A quote from a military historian: "Starvation is real and does not care how many reps you could do or how motivated you were when the campaign started. No matter how brave or strong, if you're not fed, you will falter." In practice, armies that starved would see men slip away in the night, deserting to find food, or even outright rebellions. There's an old saying, an army marches on its stomach. In medieval times, that stomach was often half empty. We should also touch on morale. Constant hunger demoralizes. Soldiers become less willing to fight. They might mutter that their lord or king is failing them. Some medieval chroniclers note that before battles, leaders had to distribute food or promise rewards to buck up the spirits of tired, hungry men. Imagine trying to summon the energy to swing a sword or draw a longbow on a calorie deficit. It's like trying to run a marathon after skipping meals for 2 days. Not exactly conducive to heroic feats. A modern person, used to perhaps 3 square meals, would feel utterly drained after just 1 day of the meager rations of a campaign. And if you are one of the unlucky ones in an outright famine scenario, by the 2nd or 3rd day of near starvation, you'd be incapacitated. Famine as a tactic. We should note that creating famine was also a deliberate tactic in war. Besiegers would starve out defenders of a castle. Scorched earth, burning crops, mills, barns, was used to starve the enemy's lands so they couldn't supply an army. The 30 Years' War, 17th century, is famous for causing famines through such tactics. But even earlier, medieval commanders did it. During the T4 100 Years' War, English raiding parties, chevauchés, would burn French villages and fields, not only to deprive the French army of food, but also to terrorize the population. Conversely, when a large army invaded, defenders would sometimes destroy food in its path to make it hard for them to sustain themselves. It was a cruel strategy because civilians suffered most, but it often slowed or weakened an invading army. One vivid historical note: during sieges, those trapped inside often ended up eating horses, dogs, and rats. At the Siege of Jerusalem in 1099 First Crusade, the Crusaders outside were short on food. They even reportedly ate some fallen enemy bodies. As noted, though that's contested, but inside the city, the defenders and civilians were also starving. Some chronicles mention they dumped weak or dead people off the walls because they couldn't feed them. Hunger doesn't distinguish between sides. Bringing it back to our scenario, after a day of insufficient food, you bed down hungry. Now try to sleep. Many of us can't sleep well on an empty stomach. In the darkness, stomach pains might wake you. You might have foraged a handful of wild berries or nuts and nibble that, but it's not enough. Your sleep is fitful, and the next morning, you must get up and do it all again, with even fewer reserves in your body. It's clear that prolonged hunger would break you within a few days. Even if you technically survive one day without collapse, the cumulative stress of calorie deficit would mean you wouldn't last. In a functional sense, you'd be too weak to fight or keep up soon. Armies expected attrition. They knew each day some men would fall out due to exhaustion or hunger. They pressed on regardless. We should mention water discipline. On marches, often water was limited. Soldiers might line up at a well, each allowed one fill. If someone drank his all at once, he'd have none later. A disciplined army tried to manage this. Like Roman legions had standards, but medieval levies probably less so. You as a newbie might gulp your flask by noon and then curse yourself when you're dry-lipped later. These are things veteran soldiers learned the hard way. Finally, one more aspect. Famine weakened the immune system. Malnourished soldiers were even more likely to catch diseases or die from wounds because their bodies couldn't heal well. So all these hardships are interconnected. A malnourished, exhausted man is more likely to get dysentery and then die from it. A starving soldier also has lower body fat, so if he gets a fever, he might succumb faster. Thus, hunger was often the prelude to or accompaniment of disease. When we say, you wouldn't last a day, hunger might not literally kill you in one day, but after that one day, you'd be so compromised that you likely wouldn't last the ensuing challenges. Many people today have never missed a meal by force. The shock of true hunger can be demoralizing in itself. In our calm storytelling manner, envision the afternoon sun casting long shadows on a column of trudging men. No lively chatter, just the shuffling of feet and creak of leather. Too tired and hungry to talk, each man is alone in his thoughts, likely fantasizing about food or water. Your own throat is parched, lips cracked, your legs feel like lead. The world starts to go a bit hazy at the edges as blood sugar drops. This is what it felt like to be a medieval soldier on campaign, more often than not. By the time we reach camp at night, you truly grasp why people might desert or collapse. And yet, our exploration isn't done. We still haven't put you in battle wearing that heavy armor you lug around. If by some misfortune you make it to the battle itself, you'll face the next set of brutal realities. The sheer physical strain of armor and the terror and violence of combat. So drink that last sip of water, nibble the last crumb of bread. We move on to the weight on your shoulders and the fight ahead. The burden of armor and arms, a heavy toll on the body. Throughout this long day, one thing has been literally weighing on you: your equipment. Medieval soldiers often carried and wore heavy gear, armor, weapons, shields, that added to their physical strain. In modern life, carrying even a 20-30 kilograms backpack for a day's hike is a significant effort. Now imagine wearing that weight as part of your clothing all day, even during fights. The physical toll of wearing heavy armor and wielding heavy weapons is enormous, even for a fit, trained individual. For someone not conditioned to it, it would be debilitating within hours or even minutes. Weight of armor. The weight a medieval warrior carried varied by his role and the era. Let's consider a late medieval knight in full plate armor, the iconic knight in shining armor. A full suit of plate armor from the 15th century typically weighed 45-55 pounds, 20-25 kilograms. Earlier in the medieval period, a knight might wear a chainmail, hauberk, around 25-30 pounds plus a helmet and other pieces, totaling maybe 40-50 pounds as well. By the late Middle Ages, high-quality plate armor was actually well distributed on the body, so a strong, trained knight could move in it quite agilely. However, the weight is still there. It's comparable to the weight modern infantry carry. Modern soldiers often carry 60 to 100 pounds of gear, but they also are exhausted by it. Research experiments have been done in modern times to measure how armor affects energy use. One study had volunteers wear replica plate armor and walk on treadmills. The results showed that walking in full armor takes 2.3 times more energy than walking without it. Even carrying the same weight in a backpack was easier than wearing it as armor, because armor's weight on the limbs, especially legs and arms, makes each movement harder. Specifically, they found wearing about 50 kilograms of armor more than doubled energy expenditure. Leg armor is particularly taxing because lifting your legs with each step is like having weights strapped to them. Volunteers noted how exhausting it was. They moved more slowly, and their breathing and heart rate soared. The lead researcher commented that, by the time fully armored knights walked across a muddy battlefield, they would have been exhausted, citing the example of French knights at Agincourt, trudging through mud in heavy armor and reaching the enemy too tired to fight effectively. Now, knights were among the fittest and most trained individuals of their time. Many trained since youth, conditioning their bodies to handle armor. They practiced jousting, swordplay, riding, etc., all in armor, so they could cope better than an untrained person. But still, even they had limits. If the battle or march went on too long, even a knight would be overcome by fatigue. There's a famous account that at the end of the Battle of Agincourt, many French knights in plate armor, once knocked to the ground in the mud, could not get back up due to exhaustion and the weight plus suction of mud. Some literally drowned face down in mud or were too weak to resist, as they were killed on the ground. That's how spent they were. For a non-knightly soldier, say a footman, the armor might be lighter, maybe just a mail shirt, helmet, and a wooden shield. But even that mail shirt might weigh 20 pounds and the shield 15 pounds. Holding a heavy shield all day is exhausting to the arm. There are historical mentions of soldiers' arms going numb from holding pikes or shields in formation for long durations. If a battle's start was delayed, men stood in ranks, gripping their weapons and shields, heart pounding, muscles tensing, and that itself could tire you out before any fighting began. Heat and armor. Armor also had another effect. It could be like a sauna in warm weather. Being encased in metal and padding led to overheating. Knights wore a padded gambeson under metal armor for cushioning. That was like a quilted jacket. Then, the metal on top traps heat. It's said that under a hot sun, knights risked heat exhaustion if not properly hydrated. We saw in the Crusades, knights adopted wearing a surcoat, cloth over the armor, to reflect sunlight and keep the sun from direct contact with metal, which helped a bit. They also learned to drink plenty of water when possible, to avoid overheating. The ones at Hattin didn't manage that, to their doom. But imagine, in summer, you are basically wearing an oven. You sweat profusely. Medieval armorers knew this. Some armor had ventilation gaps, and helmets had breathing holes. But still, after some fighting or marching, you'd be soaked in sweat. That can lead to dehydration and heat stroke. There are accounts of knights collapsing from heat. For example, at the Battle of Crécy, 1346, the weather was hot, and some heavily armored crossbowmen and knights were already tired from marching before the fight. Similarly, in the Crusades, European knights in the Middle Eastern climate really struggled with heat. One reason the lightly clad Muslim warriors often had an advantage in endurance was exactly that. They weren't weighed down as much. Cumulative fatigue. Now, consider wearing, say, 50 pounds of kit from morning until you camp at night. Even if you're not fighting the whole time, the weight wears on you. Shoulders ache, back muscles strain. Medieval soldiers likely developed chronic issues like back pain or joint pain from years of carrying armor and gear. If you are a modern person who works at a desk, suddenly lugging a 50-lab chainmail and helmet would give you immediate discomfort. By midday, you'd have bruises on your shoulders or hips where equipment rubs. Knights often got calluses or even minor nerve damage on shoulders from carrying the weight of armor. They also could get chafing. Imagine the metal chafing your skin or the sweat causing rashes under padding. Weapons. Weight. Weapons themselves, while not as heavy as, sometimes believed, added to the burden. A typical sword might weigh 2-4 pounds, 1.5 kilograms. That's not bad for a swing or two, but holding it extended in guard position for minutes, or swinging repeatedly, tires the arm. A polearm, like a halberd or pike, could weigh 6-10 pounds, and using it was like handling a long, heavy lever. A few minutes of intense fighting with it, and your arms would burn. Archers had to draw bows of high draw weight. Some English longbows were 100+ pounds draw weight. Repeatedly drawing that, plus carrying a bundle of arrows, took immense strength. In fact, skeletal analysis of longbowmen shows enlarged bone attachments in the arms, indicating overdeveloped muscles. They basically deformed their bodies to handle the bow. If you tried to draw such a bow even a few times, you'd likely fail or hurt yourself. Fighting in armor. The act of fighting while armored is its own ordeal. Sword blows, hitting your armor, still transfer force. You get bruised or staggered. Running or charging in armor spikes your heart rate. And remember, battles often lasted hours. There were usually rest moments. No one can fight continuously without pause. But at, say, the Battle of Bannockburn, 1314, fighting went on for a good part of the day. Combat was often not one long brawl, but a series of engagements. Even so, the endurance needed was extreme. Modern reenactors and martial artists who try full contact fights in armor often note that after a minute or two of intense activity, they are gasping for breath. Knights had to train to avoid exhausting themselves in the first flurry. Stamina was a prized attribute. Yet, many accounts speak of warriors collapsing from fatigue. If a battle took place late in the day, sometimes darkness or sheer tiredness ended it. Famous example, Agincourt Mud. Let's detail that scenario since it encapsulates armor fatigue. At Agincourt, the heavily armored French knights had to advance across a ploughed, the field that had turned to deep mud due to rain. Every step they took, their armor, 50 pounds or so, and the suction of mud made it agonizing. Chroniclers say the mud was knee-deep in places, and knights were sinking. By the time they slogged to the English lines, maybe a few hundred yards, they were breathing heavily as if spent. English accounts note that many French were practically collapsing by the time of melee. Imagine trying to run in a swimming pool wearing a weight vest. That's the effect. Exhaustion was so bad that lightly armed English archers, who had dropped their bows and took up mallets and swords, were able to melee and kill many armored knights, because the knights could barely lift their arms in fatigue. This demonstrates that even elite warriors in top condition could be overwhelmed by armor's weight combined with tough terrain. Now imagine you, untrained, being asked to just walk in that armor for an hour. You might be done in before even seeing an owl. Enemy. Mounting and mobility. A myth is that knights were so heavy in armor they needed cranes to mount horses. That's an exaggeration. A fit knight could mount with help of a stirrup or a boost from a squire sometimes. They could get up if knocked over, contrary to parody, but doing so in thick mud or after hours of battle was another story. Armor did not immobilize them like turtles, but it did restrict certain movements. One couldn't raise arms fully above head in some suits, or bend fully at the waist easily. If you fell and your armor shifted or got caught, it could be a struggle to get up fast. Also, once on the ground, an armored man was at risk of a dogpile. Enemies would jump on and finish him through gaps. Injuries from armor. Armor protected from cuts and many arrows, but a strong blow could still break bones underneath. Soldiers often got concussions from head strikes, even if the helmet wasn't penetrated. Ribs could crack under force against a breastplate, so you might be physically intact but terribly sore, or with hidden injuries after a fight. Wearing armor also often resulted in blisters and pressure sores, where metal pressed. Think of wearing a new pair of stiff boots. Knights wore armored boots, sabatons. Ill-fitting ones could cause bleeding blisters. They didn't have gel insoles. When armor becomes a coffin, there were extreme cases where armor actually contributed to a warrior's death, not from a weapon, but from inability to cope with conditions. For example, during the Crusade of Nicopolis, 1396, a disastrous battle against the Ottomans, some French knights wore splendid heavy armor. Many knights were killed or captured, but a number tried to escape by swimming across the Danube River. Their armor weighed them down, and some drowned. Similarly, in any river crossing or shipwreck, an armored man's odds were grim, unless he could strip it off in time. So armor could literally pull you under. Fatigue and reaction. Another thing, if you are worn out from armor, your reaction time and clarity drop. A medieval battle required awareness to parry or dodge. A tired fighter is a vulnerable fighter, 1 second too slow, and an enemy axe could find the gap in your armor at your armpit or neck. In our scenario, by mid-afternoon, if you have been wearing, say, a chainmail shirt, 25 pounds, a helmet, to 5 pounds, and maybe carrying a spear, 6 pounds, and a shield, to 10 pounds, plus a pack with a few more pounds, you might be burdened with to 45–50 pounds total. You've marched hours like this. Your shoulders ache from the mail dragging. Your left arm holding the shield is numb. The helmet feels like a lead bowl on your head, making your neck sore. You are also noticing the heat. Under the mail, you wore a padded jacket, gambeson, that is now soaked in sweat. There's sweat stinging your eyes, but the helmet's padding makes it hard to wipe your brow. You feel like you're in a furnace. Your breathing is a bit restricted. Some helms had limited airflow. Some infantry took helmets off while marching to get air, but that put them at risk if an ambush happened suddenly. If you dare loosen or remove it, you might get scolded by an officer or just risk being caught off guard. Now, if a fight breaks out, you must engage in this state. Adrenaline will surge, maybe giving a second wind for a short burst, but if the fight lasts more than a few minutes, you'll hit a wall. Many battles saw phases, an initial clash, then lulls. During lulls, men bent over heaving for breath, or drank from any source to rehydrate. But not all fights gave breathing room. If melee continued or you had to run, for example, if your side was charging or routing, armor could be deadly. Chasing a fleeing enemy in armor could cause you to overexert and collapse, so pursuit was often left to those on horseback or lightly armored. Comparisons. One might compare this to how modern firefighters wear heavy gear and can only be on the front line for so long before rotating out due to heat and weight. Medieval battles had no such rotation. Once you were in it, you endured until victory, death, or collapse. Squires and assistants. Knights had squires to help them don and doff armor. After battle, a squire might help unbuckle pieces to let the knight breathe freely. A poor common soldier had no such luxury. He might stay in his sweaty gear until he could safely remove it. Taking off armor to rest was risky if threats still nearby. Sometimes after a battle, many men died because enemies roaming the field found them too exhausted to resist. Psychological effect. Carrying heavy armor might give a sense of security. You feel safer from blows, but it also could feel like a trap. Some warriors in history abandoned parts of their armor in desperation to move faster. At Crécy, some crossbowmen threw down their steel helmets because they were retreating and couldn't run well with them. If you were panicked, that armor might feel like it's choking you. All in all, the physical toll of armor and arms means that a modern person, untrained, would be physically overwhelmed quickly. You might get maybe an hour or two of moderate exertion before exhaustion. A trained medieval soldier might last longer, but even he had limits not far beyond. The difference is training and willpower. They were used to pushing through pain and fatigue, but even the toughest man can't break the laws of physiology. Eventually, muscles give out, dehydration sets in, or heat stroke looms. Let's not forget the nighttime either. If you're on campaign and camping in potentially hostile territory, you might have to sleep in or near your armor for readiness. Some slept in gambesons or partial armor. It's hard to sleep comfortably with gear on, so that could rob you of rest, compounding fatigue next day. To illustrate with a calm, factual tone, a medieval Italian mercenary leader in a treatise advised that soldiers should rest properly and eat before battle, because if not, their arms will grow weary and their blows feeble. He knew exhaustion kills. Another account by an Arab historian about crusaders noted how the Franks, Europeans, in heavy armor, would reel from heat and thirst in battle, describing them like overloaded pack animals, almost collapsing. By early evening in our imaginary day, if you haven't even fought yet, you're probably near collapse, just from the weight you bore and the distance you traveled. If battle were to commence now, you'd enter it already worn out, a terrible disadvantage. Indeed, many battles were decided because one side was fresher, maybe they ate and rested, while the other marched a lot, or didn't eat. This might be a good point to consider. If a battle occurs on this one day we're describing, your chances of lasting through it are slim, given all the attrition already. But to truly understand not lasting a day, we should confront the battle itself, the direct brutality, which is the next and perhaps most terrifying facet. The horrors of battle, brutal combat, and its aftermath. Up to now, we've focused on the environmental and physical hardships of medieval military life: disease, hunger, exhaustion. These alone could end your life or effectiveness within a day. But suppose by some miracle you have endured the morning filth, the midday heat and hunger, and the afternoon march in armor. Now comes the ultimate test, the battle itself. This is where most people's imaginations jump to when thinking of medieval warfare: clashing swords, whistling arrows, knights charging on horseback. It's often romanticized, but the reality of medieval combat was unimaginably violent, chaotic, and grisly. The brutal realities of battle would likely traumatize or kill a modern person almost immediately. Let's set the scene calmly. Late afternoon, the two armies array for battle. You stand in your unit. Maybe you're an infantryman with spear and shield, or an archer, or a man-at-arms with sword. You are surrounded by your comrades, shoulder to shoulder. The air is thick with tension. Across the field, you see the enemy forming lines as well. Sunlight glints off helmets and spear points. Banners flap. Perhaps there's a shouted command or a horn, and then it begins. Deafening noise. The first thing that might strike you is how loud and confusing a battle is. Hundreds or thousands of men shouting war cries, the blare of horns or trumpets, the drumming of hooves if cavalry are present. As you move forward or brace for impact, you hear the whooshing sound of arrows if archers are firing en masse. Arrows might streak overhead like a dark cloud. At Agincourt, English archers sent thousands of arrows into the sky, such that contemporaries described it as a cloud that blotted out the sun. Now each arrow makes a sound and a terrifying thud when it hits flesh or shield. If you're an infantryman on the receiving end of an archery volley, you suddenly hear a rain of impacts. Arrows hitting armor with metallic pings or shields with thunking sounds, and unfortunately, arrows punching into bodies with a wet, thick sound. Men scream as they are hit, an arrow in the arm, or worse in the throat or eye. Before you've even engaged hand to hand, perhaps the man next to you goes down with an arrow through his face. This happens in seconds. A modern person, unused to such carnage, might freeze in shock or panic at this moment. Battle-hardened soldiers might still flinch, but they try to press on. Fear and adrenaline. The fear in battle is overwhelming. Your heart races like never before. Adrenaline might mask some pain and give fleeting strength, but it also can cause shakes or tunnel vision in the uninitiated. You have to somehow keep formation and follow orders, despite every instinct in you perhaps screaming to run away. Medieval discipline varied, but many soldiers did run when things looked hopeless. However, running can be as lethal as fighting. A rooting soldier is easy prey, so you force yourself to stand, closing, with the enemy. As the distance closes, you might see the whites of the enemy's eyes, or you might not see much if you're in the second rank. Just the backs of your friends and the tops of enemy helmets over their shoulders. The next moment, impact. Two lines of infantry collide. This is not a neat duel. It's a collision of human bodies. Spears thrust from both sides. Perhaps you jab your spear forward and it skids off a mail shirt, or maybe it finds a gap and plunges into someone's belly. If you stab an enemy, you'll feel a jarring resistance and then a sickening give as it pierces flesh. That enemy likely screams and collapses, maybe wrenching your spear from your hands as he falls. Now the lines have pushed together, shield against shield, like a rugby scrum, but with people trying to kill each other. It's push and shove, hack and stab. The pressure of men behind you forces you against the foe. You might be literally chest to chest with an enemy, smelling his sweat and breath, trying to swing a sword or mace in the few inches between you. People are tripping over bodies of those already fallen. Mud often battles churn soil into mud, even without rain, due to trampling and blood, makes footing treacherous. Sensory overload. The sounds are horrific. Metal clanging on metal, shields banging, men grunting, screaming in rage or agony. Horses, if present, neigh or scream when injured. There may be the trumpeting sound of a horn signaling maneuvers, barely audible over the din. The smell hits you too. Sweat, dirt, and very quickly, the coppery smell of blood. As wounds are opened, blood literally splashes or sprays. If someone's artery is cut, jets of blood can spurt out. There's also the smell of intestines if a belly is ripped open. Human intestines have a foul odor, partly fecal matter inside. On a medieval field, guts often ended up outside the body, either from cuts by swords, axes, or from war hammers, caving in an abdomen, etc. People slip on entrails on the ground. It has happened. Imagine in this melee that you manage to swing your sword at an opponent's arm. It bites into his arm, maybe not cutting it off, but deep. He howls, and blood splatters on your face or arm. Your own ears might be ringing from a blow you took on your helmet earlier. You perhaps don't even notice a cut you received on your leg, because adrenaline is high, or maybe you do feel it, a burning pain, and it scares you. Each second is life or death decisions and reflexes. A friend next to you gets stabbed. He falls, and now there's a gap. You might suddenly be facing two enemies aiming at you. You raise your shield. An axe blow hits it so hard your arm goes numb, and the shield's board cracks. Another opponent lunges a spear and catches your thigh. If it's a glancing hit, you bleed but fight on. If it's deep, your leg might give out. Chance and chaos. Medieval battles were chaotic. Command and control often broke down after initial contact. It was dark, literally and figuratively. Dust could fill the air. If dry ground, all that trampling kicks up dust. Many battles are described as engulfed in dust clouds. If near evening, or if gunpowder, later period is used, smoke and powder add to obscurity. You might not see an enemy until he's upon you. It's been described by survivors as the most confused and horrid mess imaginable. A French knight at Poitiers, 1356, said he had no idea what was happening overall, just that we fought like hell in our little corner. That's how it was, a collection of personal combats and small group struggles. Brutality of weapons. The weapons themselves inflicted terrible wounds. Swords could slash open limbs or necks. Axes could cleave skulls. A well-known archaeological example, skeletons from the Battle of Towton, 146, Wars of the Roses, England, show horrific head injuries. One skull had so many sword and axe blows that it was described that he had his face literally bisected and the back of the head smashed. Many had their teeth knocked out by blows to the jaw or deep gouges in bone. Remember, in the frenzy, multiple people might strike a fallen foe to make sure he's dead, especially if that foe was high status or particularly hated. Maces and war hammers crushed bones. A blow to the helmet with a mace could concuss or kill without breaking the helmet. The force transfers. Ribs break, teeth shatter, eyes get gouged. Some polearms had hooks or spikes to puncture visors. No mercy. Medieval battles could be fights to the death, but sometimes there were incentives to capture high-value knights for ransom. If you were a lowly infantryman, though, chances of mercy if defeated were slim. Knights might be taken captive if they yielded, because they could pay ransom. But commoners were often slaughtered if the battle was lost or if they ran. In some battles, fleeing soldiers were cut down from behind en masse. For example, at Agincourt, the English killed many French who were trying to surrender or were wounded, partly out of fear of another attack. The cruelty could be shocking to modern sensibilities. Killing prisoners occasionally occurred. If your side won, the battlefield after might see injured enemies being dispatched, speared, or throats slit, as an act of either mercy or practicality, depending on viewpoint. If your side lost and you were injured and left, you might be finished off by enemy scavengers or left to die slowly. Psychological trauma. Witnessing this carnage would be mentally devastating to someone not raised in a violent era. Many soldiers likely had what we now call PTSD from battles, though it wasn't recognized as such. Some chronicles describe knights having nightmares or pilgrimages to atone for the slaughter they did, etc. For you, seeing a friend decapitated or hearing a comrade begging for his mother as he dies with his guts out, those things could shatter your sanity on day one. A modern person might break down screaming or go catatonic. Even seasoned medieval warriors sometimes broke. There are cases of soldiers fleeing the battlefield in madness or knights having mental breakdowns later. But let's say you miraculously keep your wits. Perhaps you are running on pure instinct and survival mode. If you're lucky, you get only minor wounds and manage to stay alive until one side gains the upper hand. Maybe your side is winning. The enemy starts to retreat. At this point, discipline might break entirely as your forces chase them down. You join the chase, maybe half limping on an injured leg, but adrenaline pushing you. You come upon an enemy who tripped. Along with another comrade, you stab him mercilessly while he's down. This is not heroic dueling. It's feral. You might not have wanted to, but in the heat of bloodlust and anger, perhaps revenge for your friend who was killed, you partake in the killing frenzy. That act might haunt to you later if you have any reflective capacity left. If your side loses and you try to run, likely you'd be overtaken. A man in armor can't outrun a horse, and generally, pursuit cavalry or faster infantry would mow down stragglers. Perhaps you drop your shield or weapon to run faster, which leaves you defenseless. You hear death screams behind you as one by one, your fellows are caught. If you're caught, an enemy might just thrust a spear in your back or hamstring you with a sword, then finish you as you writhe. Surrender might not be accepted if you're low rank, or you might be taken captive to be sold as a slave common if the captors were, say, Moors taking Christian foot soldiers, or vice versa, with crusaders taking Saracen commoners sometimes. Aftermath on the battlefield. Let's assume you survived the melee, and your side holds the field. Now comes an eerie, grim phase. As night falls, or even before, you hear the groans of the wounded lying all around. Some are from your side, some enemy. It's a symphony of agony. Hundreds of men crying for water, calling out for loved ones, or moaning in pain. If you are hurt yourself, you join that chorus unless tended. The ground is littered with bodies in various states. Some cleanly dead, others horribly maimed and still alive. You might see someone crawling with their last strength, intestines trailing behind. Another man might be frantically trying to stuff a bleeding wound with a piece of cloth to stop the bleeding. Horses that are injured but not dead scream. A horse's death cry is said to be very distressing. Now, medieval practice was to help one's own wounded if possible after the battle. So you and others might start looking for comrades who can be saved. But remember, medical knowledge is primitive. If someone has a serious injury, like deep abdominal wound, or a broken limb with bones sticking out, there's little you can do beyond bandage and pray. Amputation is one procedure they use, new for badly mangled limbs. but done with no anesthesia except perhaps wine to dull pain, and often leading to death from shock or infection. A friend with a badly cut leg might beg you to help, but all you can do is wrap it in a torn cloth and give him a drink of water, if that. Many wounded simply died through the night from bleeding or shock. If you are wounded, your fate is uncertain. A shallow cut might get infected later. If an arrow is stuck in you, a surgeon would try to extract it without anesthetic. Extremely painful. They might cauterize wounds with hot iron. Imagine that searing burn on top of your other pains. You might almost prefer to pass out. Plundering and mercy killing. The field after battle also sees looters. Both fellow soldiers and local peasants might come to strip valuables from the dead, and sometimes from still living wounded. If you're lying wounded and unable to move, a scavenger might roll you over, take your purse, maybe even pull off your boots or armor, with no regard for your comfort. Some merciful ones might kill you after taking your goods, to end your misery. Others just leave you. There are accounts, for example after the Battle of Waterloo, later but analogous in aftermath, of wounded crying all night and being finished off in the morning by passing cavalry or locals. For medieval cases, after the Battle of Falkirk, 1298, it's written that the Scottish wounded on the field were dispatched by English camp followers combing for loot. Medical help. If you're lucky and get back to camp alive, the barber surgeon might tend to you, but he has dozens of cases to handle with minimal tools. He might pour strong wine on your wound, a crude antiseptic technique. If available, pick out debris, sew it with a needle and thread. No anesthesia, you bite on a stick or leather. If a limb is smashed, he might amputate it. Mortality from such surgeries was high. Fever in days after meant infection, likely fatal. Thus, even surviving battle, you might not last many days if your wounds fester. The phrase dying of wounds was extremely common, but our focus is on that single day. On that day, the battle would be the peak event that likely ends your day one way or another. Maybe it ends your life in a flash, a spear through the chest, and you collapse, shock numbing you as your vision fades. Or you take a head blow and are knocked out, possibly never waking, or waking as a prisoner. If you somehow remain alive and intact by the end of the battle, you are physically and emotionally wrecked. Exhaustion beyond description. Your muscles are jelly. Dehydration and blood loss, if wounded, make you dizzy. You might vomit from stress or from the gore around. You might break down sobbing in relief or horror. Some warriors did weep after battle, from adrenaline crash or seeing comrades dead. And then, possibly, you are tasked with helping bury the dead or burning them to prevent disease. So, after fighting, you might spend the evening dragging corpses into piles. These could include friends of yours. You have to face that loss directly, burying people in mass graves, seeing their faces staring lifeless, perhaps trying not to retch at the smell. A calm recount of brutality. To maintain our calm tone, we describe all this matter-of-factly, but the content is undeniably gruesome. Medieval chroniclers sometimes wrote in a detached tone about heaps of bodies, rivers of blood in the streets, like during the sack of Jerusalem 1099. Accounts claimed blood flowed ankle deep, an exaggeration perhaps, but indicative of how slaughter was perceived. For a listener falling asleep, this might be intense, but the monotone detail might lull some ironically, though it is dark. So why wouldn't you last a day? If anything was left that hadn't already broken you, sanitation issues, giving you disease, hunger sapping your strength, armor wearing you out. The battle itself would likely finish the job. You might literally not survive the battle's first clash, or psychologically, you might be so traumatized by that one day of combat that you'd be ruined. Many modern soldiers undergo extensive training and still can be traumatized by a single day of intense combat. A civilian with no training would be exponentially more vulnerable. In conclusion to this battle section, the brutal, gory nature of medieval combat defies our normal coping mechanisms. The average person today cannot truly fathom hacking another human to death or seeing heaps of mutilated corpses up close. In medieval times, people were more familiar with death, public executions, animal slaughter, etc. But still, battle carnage was extraordinary. Surviving veterans must have had nightmares. Some turned to faith, or drink, or told heroic narratives to cope. As the night of that day falls, if you're somehow still alive, you likely can't sleep from pain or memories of the Faln. Screams. The battlefield, once loud with war, is now eerily punctuated by moans of the dying and perhaps the howling of wolves or scavenging animals drawn to the smell of blood. You clutch a blanket around your shivering body, staring into nothingness, a 1,000-yard stare. Your day on the medieval battlefield has ended, but you are forever changed. For most, that day would be the last of their life, or at least the end of any innocence or health. The aftermath: wounds, disease, and psychological trauma. Let's extend our narrative to the immediate aftermath and the following night, because lasting a day includes making it through the night, alive and sane. If you survived the battle physically, you now face the aftermath challenges. Wound care, as discussed, is minimal. If you have a serious wound, infection will set in within a day or two. High fever might kill you by day 3 or 4. Many who survived the battle died in subsequent days. For example, some estimates say at least as many died of post-battle infections as in battle. Disease outbreak is a risk. All those corpses and filth can contaminate water and air. Often, after a battle, camps experienced higher sickness. For example, after the Battle of Agincourt, the English, already sick, had to march back to Calais. More died en route from disease or fatigue. After any big battle, an army might need to rest, but sometimes pursuit was necessary, forcing exhausted men to march again. Psychologically, you might be in shock. In a calm tone, medieval warriors had to get on with it, but they weren't unfeeling. There are accounts of knights deeply saddened at the death of comrades, or of mercenaries numb to it, depending on personality. You, the modern person, would likely be overwhelmed with acute stress reaction, trembling, replaying the horrors in your mind, possibly unable to speak, or reacting strongly. Perhaps you'd cry or vomit, or just collapse. There's no counseling or therapy available. The best you might get is a priest giving you absolution or telling you it was God's will, etc. If you lost friends, you have to bury them and process that grief while still remaining on duty. If you killed someone, you might have a moral or existential crisis, or maybe not, depending on your mindset, but likely yes, if you had no prior exposure to violence. Medieval culture often justified killing in war as honorable or necessary, which might ease some guilt, but many first-timers probably still felt disturbed. Moreover, if the war isn't over, you have to do it all again soon. That realization might break your spirit, knowing tomorrow or next week there might be another battle or a siege to endure. Medieval soldiers sometimes deserted after a particularly bad battle, unable to face more. Now we sum up: sanitation, disease, hunger, armor burden, and battle brutality. Any one of these factors could knock you out of commission. Combined, they paint a picture of an environment utterly inhospitable to a modern individual. Even seasoned medieval soldiers often succumb to these hardships. Many a campaign ended because the army literally fell apart due to disease and hunger. For example, the Ninth Crusade was aborted largely due to disease. The French invasion of Aragon in 1285 failed when their army caught disease and starved. If the professionals struggled, what chance does an outsider have? Conclusion: a reality far removed from modern life. At the end of our notional day on a medieval European battlefield, it should be abundantly clear why you wouldn't last a day there. This isn't an indictment of personal courage or strength. It's simply that the conditions were inhumanly harsh by modern standards. To recap the key points calmly: filth and lack of sanitation ensured that disease was almost guaranteed. Living in your own and others' waste, with no hygiene, would have most of us falling ill quickly. Armies that camped in one spot for days essentially sat in a pestilential fever zone of their own making. The humble latrine, or lack thereof, could spell doom for thousands. Modern individuals, used to cleanliness, would be extremely vulnerable to the bacteria and parasites omnipresent in that environment. Infectious diseases like dysentery, typhus, and others were rampant and deadly. They struck down more soldiers than weapons did. Henry V's army lost a fifth of its men to dysentery at Harfleur, illustrating how even a successful warrior king was at the mercy of microbes. A contemporary US Army saying is, "Disease is the soldier's worst enemy," and historically that was true many times over. You likely would contract a severe illness your body has never encountered by drinking the water, or simply being bitten by a camp louse, and be out of action, or dead, within days, if not within the first 24 hours of symptoms. Hunger and thirst were constant specters. Armies feared hunger more than battle, as without food, they simply couldn't function. Starvation didn't care about bravery. We saw how crusaders and other armies resorted to extreme measures, including cannibalism, when starving. A modern person unused to skipping meals would find marching and fighting on an empty stomach nearly impossible. After just one day of semi-starvation and dehydration, you would be severely weakened, dizzy, and demoralized. The physical toll of armor and weaponry would crush your untrained body. Even trained knights felt exhaustion from armor after hours of use. It's been experimentally confirmed that moving in armor uses over twice the energy of normal movement. You'd quickly overheat, tire, and perhaps collapse from heat exhaustion or muscle fatigue. At the Battle of Agincourt, armored men were literally collapsing from exhaustion before they even struck a blow. If they couldn't handle it indefinitely, you certainly couldn't. The brutality of combat was beyond anything in normal civilian life. The violence was intimate and bloody, with no safety net. One blow could maim or kill. There was no prompt ambulance, no trauma center. A grievous wound was essentially a death sentence more often than not. The psychological shock of being in such a life and death struggle, surrounded by gore and deafening chaos, would paralyze many modern people. Even if you had the bravery to engage, mere bravery can't overcome the physics of a sword through the chest or an axe splitting a skull. And such things happen to the people right next to you, if not to you. Survival required a mix of physical toughness, immunity built over time, skills, and plain luck. Medieval soldiers built some tolerance. Perhaps their guts were a bit more accustomed to bacteria, though clearly not immune, given the death tolls. And their minds were steeled by a harsher life from childhood. They might have seen animal slaughter, violent punishment, death more commonly. They also trained. A knight practiced combat maneuvers in armor regularly. A longbowman trained from youth to draw that heavy bow. A foot soldier grew up doing manual labor, which made him strong. Modern people mostly have none of those advantages. Dropped into that world, we'd be as helpless as a child in a minefield. One could argue, well, I'd just avoid doing those things. I wouldn't march or wear armor or fight. But then you wouldn't be on the battlefield. You'd be a non-combatant, possibly caught in the crossfire, or enslaved or killed by foraging soldiers anyway. On an active medieval battlefield, there is no safe place unless you're miles away. So lasting a day on it implies you are part of it. Let's momentarily imagine the best-case scenario. Suppose by sheer fortune, you avoid getting dysentery. You have enough to eat for that day. You're in relatively light armor. Perhaps you're an archer, so just a padded jack and helmet. And you even managed to not get killed in battle. You shot arrows from a distance, and the enemy routed. You might think you made it, but night comes, and in the cold camp, your stomach starts cramping. Maybe something you ate, or just nerves, or you caught a chill. By morning, you have a fever of 40 degrees Celsius and severe diarrhea, delayed dysentery after all. Within another day, you are on the brink of death. So even a good day could be followed by a fatal tomorrow. In summary, the medieval battlefield was a convergence of deadly factors: poor hygiene leading to disease, inadequate logistics leading to hunger, strenuous demands on the body, and lethal combat. Each of these alone challenges human limits. Combined, they were overwhelming. The phrase, "you wouldn't last a day," is not hyperbole. Many newcomers, levies, youth, etc., literally didn't last their first day of battle or campaign. Seasoned veterans were whittled down gradually by these hardships too. To put a final quantitative perspective, take an army of 10,000 inches, the 100 Years' War. After a month-long campaign, perhaps only 6,000 are left fit for service. Where did 4,000 go? Possibly a few hundred died in skirmishes, a few hundred more deserted or straggled, but a few thousand likely succumbed to non-combat attrition, disease, exposure, starvation. So indeed, thousands didn't last more than days or weeks. For a modern comparison, imagine no showers or toilets for a month, eating maybe one meal a day of hard bread and watery stew, carrying a big load every day, and being in constant fear of violent death. And remove any modern medical aid or communication. That is beyond a typical person's endurance. We have discussed all this in a calm, almost lullaby-like cadence, but the realities remain stark. Perhaps the gentle tone can help swallow the bitter truth of how brutal life and death on a medieval battlefield were. So, if you ever find yourself fantasizing about being a knight in shining armor or a warrior in those times, remember, the shining armor was heavy, the battlefield was a cesspit of disease, the food was scant, and the glory was drenched in blood and sweat. For the vast majority of us, we simply wouldn't last a day. As you drift to sleep after hearing this, safe in your clean bed, with a full stomach, and no imminent threat, think kindly of those who endured such trials in history. Their world was one where just surviving the day was an accomplishment. And now, we can be grateful that these horrors are kept to the pages of history and not a reality we must face when the sun rises. Sweet dreams, far away from the clang of swords and the cries of the battlefield. You have journeyed through a day of medieval warfare in your imagination and emerged on the other side. A feat that, in flesh and blood, would be next to impossible for any of us today.